I was born in 1982 in a remote village in Jilin province. Like many children from remote villages, my childhood and life were spent in simplicity and monotony. There's a saying that, simplicity is true happiness. I thought my life would continue just like that, but life is unpredictable, always taking us by surprise. Now, I'd like to share with you a strange and mysterious story. You can take it as just a tale, or laugh it off. Even though this is my personal experience, when I recall it now, it feels as if I had lived through a dream. It haunts me, hard to let go, yet sometimes I feel it never truly happened in my life. It was 13 autumns ago when a girl suddenly entered my life and completely disrupted it. To this day, I still remember October 3, 2000, an ordinary day that couldn't have been more mundane, but to me, it's unforgettable. It was the National Day Golden Week, also the busy harvest season in the Northeast. That day, I was busy harvesting corn in my family's field. Just when I was sweating profusely, cutting down the last few corn stalks at the edge of the field, and preparing to sit down and rest for a bit, I suddenly noticed a slender, beautiful girl sitting on a small path in front of me. She was sitting with her head slightly tilted, and her long, black hair covered her face. Although I couldn't see her face clearly, from her figure and elegant clothing, I had never seen such a heart-stirring girl in my life. I'm not the type to freeze when I see a pretty girl, but at that moment, I didn't know what came over me. It was as if I were bewitched, I couldn't take my eyes off her. Standing there, holding the sickle in my hand, I just stared at her in a daze. Looking back now, I must have looked incredibly foolish. You're from which village? After staring at this fairy-like girl for over a minute, I finally stammered out. The girl slowly turned her head. It was noon, and the strong light shone on her already pale face, making her appear even more bloodless. If she weren't so extraordinarily beautiful, I would have thought I was seeing a ghost in broad daylight. She sat there motionless, holding her left foot as if it was sprained. She looked at me for a long time and said, "I came to the mountains with my family. I got separated from them and lost my way." When I heard that, I didn't think it was strange. This place was near the long white mountain range, and this girl was probably from the city, out on a trip with her family to Long White Mountain and got separated. Looking at how fashionable she was dressed and then at myself, I realized we were from completely different worlds. Thinking of this, I decided not to bother anymore. I grabbed my sickle and was about to head home for lunch. Just as I was about to leave, the girl's incredibly sweet voice called out from behind, "I'm so thirsty and hungry right now. Can you help me find a place to rest?" I turned around and saw her looking at me with hopeful eyes. I thought to myself, leaving a fragile girl like her alone in this desolate place would be a bit too much. "All right, come with me for now. I'll take you home, and my mother can cook something for you." The girl's face lit up with joy as she stood up, but her legs gave way, and she almost fell. I quickly rushed over to support her. It seemed like her left foot was seriously injured. Still, she insisted, "It's okay," but her words made me break out in cold sweat. Her body was soft and gentle to the touch, but oddly enough, she was freezing cold, with no warmth at all. I wiped the sweat from my forehead and looked at her with a bit of fear. From childhood, Miller the village elder, who was always muttering about superstitions, often told children ghost stories. I grew up listening to her eerie tales. Could it be that I've actually encountered a ghost in broad daylight today? She saw my expression and gave a gentle smile. "I have a bit of a fever, so my body is really cold." Summoning my courage, I reached out and touched her forehead. Her touch was ice cold, like I had touched a block of ice. "Sister, this isn't a fever, you're freezing." I'm really sick right now. I can't walk anymore. Could you carry me home?" "I'll pay you more," she said, pulling out 200 yuan from her pocket and handing it to me. I tried to refuse, but she forced it into my hand. A man takes money to solve problems, I thought to myself, and besides, she was so beautiful, there was no way I'd lose out. So, I carried her on my back and headed home. But the moment I lifted her, I regretted it to my core. She was so light, almost weightless, like a ball of cotton stuck to my back. Fear gripped me, and I didn't dare look back at her. At this moment, the desolate path was completely empty. The autumn wind blew, sending a strand of her black hair into my mouth. The cold sensation spreading from my back made my heart freeze even more. I was now almost certain that the girl on my back was definitely not human. If she wasn't human, then what was she? I didn't dare to think further. I didn't dare to speak. All I could do was shakily walk home, my legs trembling. I could even hear the pounding of my own heart. The thing on my back stayed silent, only tightening her pale, soft arms around my neck. She rested her head against my ear. Normally, if the horny boys in the village saw me carrying such a beautiful girl, they would have been green with envy. But right now, only I knew that I was in deep trouble. Something big was happening because her head had been leaning against my ear for quite a while, yet I hadn't heard her breathe even once. What kind of expression does a person show when they're extremely nervous? I didn't have a mirror at the time, but I bet my face was even paler than hers. Trembling, I carried her toward the village. At the village entrance, I ran into Dave Swan, a young man from the village. His family owned the most land in the village, dozens of acres. He was the rich kid of our village, Dragon Harmony Village. This guy was about my age, naturally lustful, always scheming to win over the girls in the village. When he saw me carrying such a beautiful girl, his eyes darted around wildly, looking at me and the girl. I had no intention of acknowledging him, so I kept my head down and continued walking home. Dave Swan stared at me, completely captivated by the girl on my back, until we were far away. He stomped his foot and cursed, then dragged his wife, who was sitting under the big tree at the village entrance, over to Old Lady Miller, the village elder who supposedly knew everything. Old Lady Miller, you know everything, don't you? Tell me, why is it that my family is so rich, yet I never meet such a beautiful girl? Look at that poor guy Billy Thompson, he's dirt poor, and he still manages to bring home such a stunning girl. Where's the justice in that? Dave Swan spoke to Old Lady Miller in distress. Granny son, take a look and help me, please. Old Lady Miller glanced in my direction, her eyes half closed, her usual superstitious demeanor absent from her face. She sighed and said to Dave Swan, Jen Gunn, listen to me, the farther you stay from that girl, the better. I finally carried the girl back home. For me, that journey was no less than a 25,000-mile-long march. Entering the yard, I couldn't even remember which leg stepped in first. Our dog, Blackie, who was tied up in the yard, reacted strangely upon seeing the girl. It didn't bark once, just obediently retreated to its kennel. Usually, you're so fierce, why are you acting all scared now? I glared at Blackie, cursing it silently. I set the girl down, not daring to look at her, standing there trembling. Part of it was out of fear, and part of it was because she was so cold, icy cold. My father was out handling business in the city and hadn't returned yet. Only my mother was home. Seeing me bring back such a beautiful, delicate girl, my mother looked a bit surprised. Why are you so late for lunch, Billy? And who is this girl? I forced a weak smile, not daring to tell my mother what I really thought. If I angered this mysterious being, my mother might even get caught up in it. I replied, Mom, she's from the city. She probably came to Long White Mountain for a trip and got lost. She sprained her ankle in our field, so I brought her back. Upon hearing this, my mother nodded. She is a kind-hearted, simple farmer, and naturally, she approved of my actions. Oh, come on in, girl, the meal's just ready. After you eat, let Billy take you out of the mountains. You never know when a few wild wolves might appear around here. It's dangerous for you to be wandering alone in this area, my mother said as she hurriedly invited her inside. The girl was very polite, greeting my mother. I stole a glance at her, her smile was even more beautiful, a smile you couldn't help but like. It was clear that my mother liked her very much and warmly welcomed her to sit down for a meal. Only I knew the truth, silently bearing the weight of it all. I couldn't even speak of my fear. I wondered, am I bringing a wolf into our house? Our place, in this poor rural area, didn't have much to offer. My mother had made stewed potatoes with green beans, paired with pickled radish, and a big pot of steamed buns. She thought a girl from the city would be picky and not used to such simple, rustic food. But to her surprise, the girl ate with great relish, continuously saying how delicious it was, all while chatting with my mother. Though she wasn't formal in the least, her demeanor clearly reflected that of a refined lady. My mother and the girl were enjoying a lively conversation, while I sat silently, my heart pounding with worry. After more than 10 minutes, I barely managed to finish half a steamed bun. By the time we finished eating, it was already past 1 p.m. The girl told my mother she wanted to leave, but my mother had grown so fond of her that she refused to let her go, insisting that she stay the night. Hearing this, I quickly said to my mom, "Mom, she wants to go back, so let her. Our house is nothing like the city. If she feels uncomfortable, what will we do?" My mom replied, "You silly child. At this hour, how do you plan on getting out of the village? We don't even have a motorcycle here, and if you try to get her out of the mountains, it'll be dark by the time you do. What if you run into some wild animal? Let her stay here for the night, and in the morning, you can take her back." Before I could say anything, the girl smiled and said, "Thank you so much, Auntie. You're very thoughtful." Hearing that, I almost fainted. It's over, this is really over. What if she wakes up in the middle of the night, gets thirsty, and drains my blood? I spent the whole afternoon in a daze, unable to think clearly. The girl, however, seemed completely at ease, even sitting at the table and touching up her makeup. But to me, no matter how beautiful she was, she didn't seem human at all, just looking at her gave me chills. That night, my mom arranged a room for her to sleep in. She happily accepted it and seemed quite pleased with the room. In the countryside, we have plenty of space, so rooms aren't lacking. I lay in my room, tossing and turning, unable to sleep. Around midnight, still unable to fall asleep, I got up. I remembered that earlier in the day, she had even given me 200 yuan. Considering it, there was some gain, but when I took 200 yuan out of my pants pocket and looked, I was shocked, nearly fainting. These were indeed 2 big bills, but the denomination was 10 billion. Looking at the 2 funeral money bills in my hand, I wanted to cry but couldn't. In broad daylight, they were clearly 2 100 yuan bills. How did they turn into this now? A strong sense of unease flooded my mind, and my heart was about to jump out of my chest. Do I really have to think about that thing now? Could it really not be human? I go to bed every night before 10 p.m., but tonight I just couldn't sleep. My clothes weren't off, I was just staring blankly at the clock on the wall. The hands of the clock were pointing right at midnight. The girl sleeping in the next room, I didn't know what she was doing at this hour. To gather some courage, I found the half bottle of double kasha liquor my dad had left, and drank 2 large gulps. In no time, I was feeling dizzy. Sometimes alcohol is indeed a good thing, it made me braver. I walked back and forth in my room, but my heart was still pounding with anxiety. In the middle of the night, the girl next door might be a female ghost. The more I thought, the more terrified I became. In northeast China, the October nights were cool, but my clothes were now soaked with sweat. The wall clock's pendulum still ticked steadily, mixed with the sound of my heavy heartbeat. Every second was torture. Continuing like this wasn't a solution, wasn't I just waiting for death? Mom seemed to really like him, almost completely defenseless, even during meals. But what if he harmed Mom in the middle of the night? No way, I've got to go all out. Even if he sucks my blood, I can't let Mom get hurt. Thinking of this, I quietly slipped out of my room, gently closing the door behind me. Our house is a standard rural home with 4.5 tiled rooms, 2 rooms separated by a hallway. I stood in the pitch-dark hallway, staring at the tightly closed door in front of me, my legs shaking. Damn it, I had no idea what he was doing in there. Was he lying on the bed, sleeping quietly, or flying around the room? It was midnight now, still far from dawn. Who knows what terrifying thing might happen tonight? I gritted my teeth and reached out to pull open the door. Inside, it was pitch black, so quiet you could hear a pin drop. I quietly stepped inside and glanced toward the bed. It was a cloudy night, no moonlight, so I couldn't see anything. My trembling hand flicked on the room's light, and immediately I clenched my fists, looking toward the bed. What I saw. But the sight left me dumbfounded. Under the dim light, I saw a neatly made bed, with a pink coat lying on top, the same one he wore during the day, and a pair of light blue jeans folded neatly beside it. I stared for a while, feeling relieved. Where is he? I scanned the room several times, but there was no trace of the girl. I knew the opponent was dangerous and powerful, but I had no idea where she was now. I was on the verge of collapsing. The 2 gulps of double cassia liquor I had earlier had now seeped out along with the cold sweat. Instinctively, I bolted for the door. Bad luck strikes at the worst times. I was so focused on escaping that I didn't notice and slammed my head into the doorframe. A big bump instantly formed on my forehead, and I was completely sobered up. I cursed inwardly, rubbing my forehead, just about to look for him when I heard the sound of water splashing outside. That sound was so familiar. During the hot summer days, I'd leave a large basin of water in the yard during the day to use for bathing at night. Hearing the water, it was clear someone was bathing outside. What on earth was going on? Mom is a very conservative person, and with a guest in the house today, there's no way she'd be bathing outside. Could it be that the girl is bathing? Thinking about the clothes she left on the bed, I became even more convinced. At that moment, my mind was in chaos, like a pot of porridge. In the middle of the night, a female ghost bathing in the yard of my house. What kind of stunning scene would that be? I honestly didn't know whether I should be thrilled or burst into tears. They say, curiosity killed the cat, but in reality, curiosity can also kill a dog. I could never have imagined what was about to happen next. Not only was I the victim, but even my beloved guard dog, Blackie, couldn't escape fate. Though I was afraid, my intense curiosity drove me out the door and into the yard. I looked around and saw Blackie, who was usually fierce. If a stranger entered the house, he would have loved nothing more than to pounce and tear off a piece of flesh. But today was different. Since the girl arrived, Blackie hadn't barked once. Now, he was calmly lying in his kennel. The sound of water splashing grew louder, causing my heart to race. Mustering all my courage, I looked toward the source of the sound. The sight nearly gave me a nosebleed. There in front of me was a graceful girl, slender yet full of charm, completely naked under the cover of night. In her hand, she held half of a gourd, pouring water over herself, scrubbing her soft white skin. Her backside was curvaceous and inviting, with a figure that was perfectly proportioned, making it impossible to look away. I stood there, dumbstruck. Even though I had preconceived that she wasn't human, maybe something unclean, in the face of such a tempting, graceful body and alluring face, I suddenly felt the urge to die under the flowers, even as a ghost. So I blurted out something incredibly foolish, "Is the water cold? How about I heat up some hot water for you?" After hearing my clueless comment, she didn't seem surprised at all, as if she had known I was peeking the whole time. She turned her head and smiled at me. "Stop looking, haven't you seen enough in your past life?" I was baffled. Past life? What do you mean? When did I ever see you bathe in a past life? Seeing my nervous and puzzled expression, she let out a smirk. "You'll understand later. Now go grab me a towel." After saying that, she turned her head back, stepping barefoot into my large bathtub, sitting down and carefully scrubbing her body. This was the first time I had ever seen a girl's bare, white body. Due to the harsh conditions of the countryside, I hadn't even seen a romance movie. My heart was racing even faster, though my fear had significantly diminished. She spoke with a soft and gentle voice, still soothing to the ears. Without thinking much, I did as she said. I rushed back into the house, grabbed a towel, and hurried back to the yard. At first, my fear of her had subsided quite a bit, but the bloody scene in the yard at that moment sent my heart plunging into the abyss. The horrifying sight before me still gives me chills whenever I recall it. I saw her holding Blackie with one hand, and with the other, she quickly grasped his neck. 2 fingers viciously tore open Blackie's throat. Poor Blackie whimpered once, and in an instant, he died without a sound. I let out a scream, unable to believe what was happening before my eyes. I had such a strong bond with Blackie, and I never imagined he would be killed by her, right in front of me, no less. Just as I was trying to catch my breath, something even more shocking occurred. She lifted Blackie high above her head, letting the blood from his throat gush out and splatter all over her naked body. In an instant, her already blood-red skin was drenched in Blackie's blood, making her look even more eerie under the dark night sky. Blood. I collapsed heavily onto the ground, cold sweat pouring down. I swear, in that moment, as I looked at her tempting, steel-like body, I didn't have a single wicked thought. When Blackie's blood fully soaked into her, she finally seemed satisfied, tossing Blackie's lifeless body aside. Her spirit seemed much better than before, and she contentedly used the gourd to wash the blood off her body. Are you human or ghost? I sat on the ground, my voice hoarse as I asked. She walked up to me, her steps light, reached out and took the towel from my hand, drying herself off. Slowly, she made her way back to the room she was staying in. Without turning her head, she said, "Come in." I hesitated for a moment, but thought, if it's fate, you can't escape it. So, I followed her inside. When she saw me trembling at the door, she calmly put on the clothes that were laid on the bed. "Don't be scared, come sit next to me." I thought to myself, if I weren't scared in this situation, I'd be just like you, a ghost. She sighed when I didn't come closer and said, "I can tell you, my name is Elaine, and I'm not human, I'm a ghost." Even though I had mentally prepared myself, hearing her admit it still sent chills down my spine. "So, what exactly are you doing at my house?" I could feel my voice trembling as I spoke. "I really came to find you, but don't worry, I won't hurt you. I'd never harm you." I thought to myself, if I believe your nonsense, I must be out of my mind. "What did Blackie ever do to you? Why did you have to kill him?" She suddenly burst into a cold, eerie laugh. That sound was as piercing as it could get, making my scalp tingle. "Ha ha ha ha. Let me show you my secret, and then you'll understand," she said, as she began to take off her clothes piece by piece. I thought to myself, what is she planning now? Does she want to seduce me? Or maybe she'll kill me like she killed Blackie when I'm off guard. As I was lost in wild thoughts, she had already stripped completely naked. I knew if I kept looking, something bad would happen. But being a young guy full of energy, how could I resist such temptation? I couldn't help but keep looking. Her stunning body made my face flush and my heart race. I swallowed hard, feeling myself getting harder down below. But, tragically, just a few seconds later, my once proud soldier wilted. Because I saw, as she closed her eyes, her snow-white skin started to disappear, revealing brownish-red flesh underneath. Under the light, I could even see her veins and bulging blue tendons. Looking at her face, it was just like her body, no skin left at all. Ever since I met her at the cornfield at noon, my nerves had been on edge. But this horrifying scene before me was too much for my senses to handle. My eyes rolled back, and I collapsed to the ground, unconscious. I don't know how long I was out. When I slowly woke up, I found myself lying on the bed, my head resting on a pillow. The skinless female ghost who called herself Elaine had now returned to her beautiful and delicate appearance. She had already put on her clothes and was sitting next to me, watching me. I screamed, "Oh my God," and jumped up from the bed, ready to leap onto the ground and run as far away as possible. It was terrifying. But the ghost, Elaine, stretched out her hand and grabbed my wrist. "Don't even think about leaving," she said. What do you want?" "Sister Ghost, I'm really scared, please, don't frighten me anymore." I was on the verge of collapsing, and I couldn't run. Her grip was surprisingly strong, and no matter how much I struggled, I couldn't break free. Seeing me like this, she almost laughed but held it back, sighed, and said, "I didn't expect you to be so cowardly in this life. You weren't like this in your past life." "You know what I was like in my past life?" I asked. She nodded, her deep, dark eyes gazing at me. "Yes, in your past life, you saved me, even willing to sacrifice your life. Unfortunately, both our fates were tragic." Looking at Elaine now, so gentle and cute, I couldn't believe that just moments ago, she was the fierce ghost who had killed Blackie. Her words only left me more confused, as if I was lost in a mist. I kept reminding myself, this is all an illusion, she's just putting on an act in front of me. "So you're saying we knew each other in a past life?" I took a deep breath, finally feeling some relief as it seemed like she didn't have any harmful intentions toward me. Elaine nodded and turned her head to look out the window, lost in thought. "You've reincarnated and forgotten everything, but I still remember. I won't let those who wronged us get away." After saying that, her clear and gentle eyes suddenly became sharp and fierce, making my heart race in fear. "No way, Elaine, who hurt us in our past life? Look, I've reincarnated on time, so let's just leave it all behind." I stammered, trying to console her. Although my current life in a remote village was tough, I wasn't so crazy as to believe her ghostly stories or join her in seeking revenge. Elaine seemed to notice that I didn't fully believe her, so she didn't say anything more. She let go of my hand and even straightened out my messy clothes. "Telling you this now, you probably can't accept it right away, but one day you'll understand everything." Seeing her serious expression, I started to believe her a little. Could it be true, as she said, that we were deeply connected in a past life? But then, when I recalled her brutally killing Blackie, I felt nauseous. "Even if you want revenge, don't use Blackie as a victim. He's just a dog." Elaine let out a soft laugh, her smile as radiant as blooming flowers, her youthful appearance adding to her allure. "Every 2 weeks, I have to bathe in a blood rain, otherwise, I'll remain in this skinless state. So I had no choice but to sacrifice your dog." Hearing this, I was so enraged I almost lost my composure. She actually used my beloved Blackie like bath soap. "What happened to your skin?" I asked. Elaine replied, 127 years ago, after you died to save me, that heartless, wolf-hearted Taoist stripped it away." As she said this, she gritted her teeth, and I could even faintly see tears in her eyes. No way. She had been through such a painful ordeal. Now I wasn't just afraid of Elaine, I felt a tinge of sympathy for her. If what she said was true, and we were both tragically wronged in our past lives, then we were truly bound by the same misfortune. But still, humans and ghosts live in separate worlds. Even if I had some kind of relationship with her in the past, now we're living in 2 different worlds. I really didn't know what to do. "When are you leaving?" I asked tentatively. Elaine was taken aback, looking at me with confusion. "I've finally found you after all this time, why would I leave? I plan to stay here with you." Hearing this, I felt like hanging myself. She's not planning to leave. If a female ghost were to stay in my house for a long time, every 10 days or so, killing a big dog to bathe in blood, oh my God, how am I supposed to live like this? At this point, I'm at a loss. She doesn't want to leave, and I can't force her out either. If I anger her, neither my mother nor I will survive. Elaine, you should get some rest. I don't know if ghosts like you need to sleep, but I'm really tired and going back to sleep. Saying this, I turned around and went back to my room. But how could I sleep? If I stayed with her any longer, I'd probably be on the verge of losing my mind. I lay there with my eyes open until dawn, which felt like an entire year. In the morning, my mom got up early, and as soon as she stepped outside, I heard her scream. I quickly ran out and saw her standing in front of Blackie's body, staring blankly at the horrific sight. "For eyes, come out here and look." "What happened?" she called out to me, clearly distressed. I walked over to Blackie's body, feeling a deep sorrow. Blackie had been with me for more than 2 years, and now he had died so tragically. "Mom, it looks like some wild animal killed Blackie," I lied, unable to tell her the truth. My mom was just as heartbroken by Blackie's death. Life in the mountain village was tough, and Blackie had cost our family over 300 yuan. Mom asked me to bury Blackie, saying that he had protected our home for over 2 years. We couldn't sell him for meat anymore. With tears in my eyes, I dug a hole under a plum tree in the yard and buried Blackie. At that moment, Elaine also got up, acting like nothing had happened. She was chatting and laughing with my mom and even went into the kitchen to help her cook. I was baffled, wondering how a ghost could move around both day and night. Isn't it said that ghosts are afraid of daylight? Could it be that she had cultivated her powers to a higher level? "Girl, after breakfast, let Billy help take you down the mountain to find your family," my mom comforted Elaine. But to my surprise, Elaine shook her head. "Auntie, my foot hasn't healed yet, and I'm afraid I can't walk. If it's not too much trouble, I'd like to stay at your house to recover before I leave." Hearing this, I quickly gave my mom a look, signaling her not to agree. But my kind-hearted and simple mom didn't notice me, and with a smile, she said, "All right, stay as long as you need. I'm just worried our living conditions aren't the best, and you might not be comfortable." Elaine smiled brightly. "No, Auntie, thank you so much." Her pretty face beamed with joy, but to me, there was something eerie and unsettling about her smile. I can't even remember what we ate during that meal, only that I was sitting at the table with a ghost. If she weren't so beautiful, I would have probably spit out every bite I took. My mom, on the other hand, got along well with Elaine, thinking that this city girl was both steady and generous. She kept giving her food and asking her questions, afraid that she might feel left out. Elaine, at this moment, acted like a new daughter-in-law, treating her mother-in-law with ease and grace. Every gesture and word she said was so well-mannered that there wasn't a single flaw to pick at. I sneaked a glance at her. Her face was truly gorgeous. I thought to myself, if only she were human, I'd definitely marry her. After finishing the meal, my mom told me to go out and work in the fields. It was harvest season, and we needed to hurry to bring the crops home. Hearing this, I felt a surge of anxiety. I couldn't leave my mom at home alone. Who knows when this powerful ghost, who easily killed Blackie, might flip out. The consequences would be unimaginable. Thinking of this, I said to my mom, "Mom, how about you come to the field with me? I can't finish harvesting everything by myself." My mom replied, "But who will feed the pigs and chickens? The litter of piglets just born 3 days ago needs someone to watch them." I was so anxious that I almost dragged my mom aside to tell her that Elaine was a ghost. But rationality held me back. If Mom knew, it would only put her in more danger. Just as I was at a loss, Elaine suddenly spoke up, "Auntie, how about I go with Billy to help harvest the corn?" I couldn't help but glance at Elaine, and she gave me a sly smile. In that moment, I understood everything. She could see right through my thoughts. She knew I wasn't comfortable leaving her alone with my mom, so she suggested coming with me to the field. Turns out, meeting a ghost isn't the scariest thing. Meeting a clever, perceptive ghost is what's really tricky. After hearing Elaine, my mom laughed and said, "Child, your foot is still injured, and you're a guest. How could I let you do work?" Elaine replied, "It's all right, Auntie. If I can't work, I'll just chat with Billy and keep him company. He seems to have plenty of energy." Hearing this, I thought, oh, come on. With you around, my legs are weak as jelly. How can I have any strength to work? Even though I was completely unwilling, I couldn't send her away, and at least with her by my side, my mom would be safe. After finishing the meal and resting for a bit, I grabbed the sickle and led Elaine toward the cornfield. As we left the yard and walked along the dirt road at the edge of the village, I noticed there were more people sitting under the trees chatting than usual. Old Lady Miller, who was always muttering strange things, sat there every day telling these idle folk stories about snake spirits and mystical beings. When they saw me walking with Elaine, all eyes suddenly turned to us. "Hey, Billy, off to work in the fields?" Old Lady Smith, always cheerful, called out to me. I smiled at Old Lady Smith and nodded in response. Now I felt a bit awkward. You see, in this small village, news spreads fast. If someone farts on the east side, they'll hear it on the west side. Let alone the fact that yesterday I brought home a beautiful girl, and she stayed the night. This is definitely explosive news in Dragon Harmony Village. I glanced at Elaine beside me. She's really adding to the chaos, being the center of attention already, and now she pulls this. With just 2 fingers, she took down Blackie, yet she claims she can't walk. No choice but to play along. When you're under someone else's roof, you have to lower your head. I held her cold arm and continued walking. The elderly folks sitting by the road all widened their eyes, watching us closely, whispering in amazement. In a big city, or more developed places, a young couple being together wouldn't be anything surprising. But here, in this remote and closed-off Dragon Harmony Village, Elaine being so close to me would certainly cause gossip. I admit I'm shy, my face turned a bit red. I hurriedly pulled Elaine forward, wanting to get out of their sight as quickly as possible. Seeing me like this, Elaine couldn't help but laugh softly. Her smile was enchanting, and with the morning sunlight shining on her delicate face, she looked even more captivating. I couldn't help but stare at her, blurting out, "Elaine, you're so beautiful." But as soon as the words left my mouth, I regretted it, wanting to slap myself, because I suddenly remembered the skinless body she had shown me last night. It was terrifying. Elaine was also surprised when she heard me say that. She stayed silent for a long time, then softly said, "Brother Billy, slow down a bit, my foot hurts." I was at a loss for words, not sure if her foot really hurt or if she was just pretending. I had no choice but to support her as we walked slowly. But as we passed Old Lady Miller, the eccentric old lady who often seemed a bit mentally unstable, she suddenly shuddered and let out a strange cry, standing up from the ground. Old Lady Miller's sudden move gave me quite a scare, and I cursed inwardly, "This old lady looks like she's about to come back to life as a ghost." My heart had already been put through enough shocks, and now she was making it worse. The strange thing was, when Elaine saw Old Lady Miller, the arm she had wrapped around mine suddenly became even colder. I could faintly hear her teeth grinding together, and a cold aura seemed to radiate from her, seeping into me and making me shiver. After Elaine and Old Lady Miller locked eyes for a few seconds, Old Lady Miller quickly dropped her usual crazy demeanor, pursed her lips, and headed straight home with her head down. The children who had been listening eagerly to her ghost stories began shouting for her to come back and continue, but Old Lady Miller didn't look back, disappearing down a small alley shortly after. I stared at her fading figure, feeling that something was off. In Dragon Harmony Village. The boldest person in the village is probably Old Lady Miller, but why did she suddenly leave when she saw Elaine? Could it be that she realized Elaine is a ghost? While I was still guessing wildly, a guy suddenly popped out from the crowd, grinning as he walked over to me and Elaine. He reached out and slapped Elaine on the butt, laughing, "Hey there, are you related to Yen Tu Call?" I looked up and saw it was Dave Swan, the richest young man in the village. While everyone else who was strong and able had gone to work in the fields, he didn't need to. His family owned a lot of land, and every year, his father would hire people to work for them during harvest time. I'd never liked Dave Swan. He always bullied others, relying on his family's wealth. Now he was making inappropriate moves on Elaine. Although she was a ghost, for some reason, a wave of anger surged within me. I clenched my fists, ready to confront Dave Swan. In my mind, I thought, if he didn't apologize to Elaine, I'd beat him up. But just then, Elaine let out a cold laugh, glanced at Dave Swan, satisfied after taking advantage of the situation, and then turned to me, saying, "Brother Billy, let's not bother with him. Sometimes, those who take advantage will suffer greatly in the end." Seeing the cold smirk on Elaine's face, I felt a chill run down my spine. At that moment, Elaine's eyes suddenly turned blood red. I almost screamed, but the state only lasted for less than half a second, and only I saw it. Before I could say anything, Elaine tugged at me and said, "Brother Billy, let's hurry to the fields." She dragged me along, but a sense of dread rose within me. Something bad was surely going to happen to Dave Swan. Nearby, Old Man Taylor, a respected elder, spoke seriously to Dave Swan. "Jen Gunn, didn't Old Lady Miller warn you yesterday to stay away from that girl? Why are you messing with her?" Dave Swan dismissed him with a sneer. "You don't have to worry about me. I just can't stand that poor bastard Billy. Damn, these days, even the best girls get taken by pigs like him." Old Man Taylor frowned and said, "Hey, kid, if Billy found a pretty wife, that's his blessing. What are you so jealous about? And I think Old Lady Miller is usually right about things. You should really listen to her and stay away from that girl." Dave Swan rolled his eyes and said to Old Man Taylor, "If you weren't my dad's cousin, I'd have beaten you up by now." Old Man Taylor, visibly angered, pointed at him and said, all right. I won't bother with you anymore. You're getting more and more out of hand." Their conversation reached my ears, and I clenched my teeth in anger. I thought, "Dave Swan, one day I'll make sure to teach you a proper lesson." Elaine seemed to sense what I was thinking and gently held my hand, as if trying to comfort me. We walked hand in hand toward the cornfield. Her hand was still as cold as ever, with no warmth at all, but I suddenly realized that I wasn't as afraid of her anymore. When we arrived at the field, I glanced at Elaine's hand and said, "Xiao Yan, just sit down and wait for me. I have to work now." Saying that, I shook off the numbness in my cold hands and got ready to start cutting the corn. Elaine stood silently nearby, watching me work. When a person stays tense for too long, they eventually become calm, and that's exactly what happened to me. After all, I couldn't shake her off, so I decided to just go with the flow. In the northeastern autumn, the mornings and evenings are cool, but as noon approaches, it becomes unbearably hot. By around 10 a.m., I was drenched in sweat, completely exhausted. Elaine, who had been quietly accompanying me all the while, suddenly walked over and took out a white handkerchief from her pocket, gently wiping the sweat off my forehead. "Brother Billy, let's head back. You're so tired," she said with a hint of concern in her voice. I looked at her and realized she seemed genuinely worried about me. I didn't know whether to be happy or helpless. Finally, someone cared for me, but unfortunately, she was a ghost. I have to work even if I'm tired. What else can I do? I sighed and said, "You don't need to worry about this." In the evening, Elaine told me she would find some helpers and finish the work in one night. She smiled mysteriously, not giving me a chance to say anything, and pulled me home. I didn't understand what Elaine meant, but seeing her confidence, I decided to wait and see what would happen later that night. As we passed the village entrance, Dave Swan was still loitering around. When he saw Elaine and me returning, he snorted in disdain and gave me a fierce glare. I thought to myself, go ahead, act all cocky. I'll deal with you when the time comes. With a glance, I noticed Dave Swan was leering at Elaine, his eyes wandering over her body with a lustful gaze, as if he wanted to devour her. Elaine, on the other hand, didn't seem to notice him at all, holding my hand affectionately as we walked home, making Dave Swan turn green with envy. When we got home, my mom, of course, scolded me for a bit. Why are you home instead of working in the fields on such a sunny day? I didn't know what to say in response. Mom sighed and said, if you're tired, just rest for today. Go back to the fields tomorrow. Throughout the day, Elaine helped my mom a lot with the housework, not minding the dirt or the effort. My mom was surprised that a city girl like her could be so hardworking and unafraid of getting her hands dirty. If it weren't for the fact that she felt I wasn't good enough for Elaine, my mom might have even tried to matchmake us. Later that evening, after dinner, Elaine quietly told me that she had some things to take care of and asked me to stay home and wait for her. With that, she left on her own. I figured Elaine might have gone to help me cut the corn. She mentioned during the day that she would find some helpers to do the work, but I wasn't sure if that was true. Thinking about it, it seemed unlikely. Could a ghost really do farm work? So I stayed home waiting for her, but even by 11 p.m., she still hadn't returned. After being awake all night, I was exhausted, and as soon as my nerves finally relaxed, I fell into a deep sleep. I slept soundly through the night, waking up at around 7 a.m. When I got up, I found Elaine chatting with my mom. My mom had already prepared breakfast and set it on the table, waiting for me to join them. I glanced at Elaine, and she seemed to be in high spirits. I had no idea what time she returned or what she had done overnight. As we were eating, we suddenly heard a commotion outside, with cries of grief drifting in. My mom and I both looked out the window, and we saw a crowd gathering on the small path leading to the house, as if something big had happened. In the small village of Dragon Harmony Village, any little disturbance quickly becomes known to everyone. And so early in the morning, something big had clearly happened, as the entire village came out to watch. My mom and I put down our chopsticks and went outside to see what was going on. We saw Dave Swan's father, Richard Swan, was squatting on the ground, smoking non-stop, looking completely defeated, a far cry from his usual arrogant demeanor. Next to him was a large wooden plank, and lying on it was Dave Swan. His mother was kneeling on the ground, crying her heart out, sobbing, "Oh heavens, how are we supposed to go on? What did we do to deserve this? Why does my son, Dave, have to suffer like this?" I glanced at Dave Swan lying on the plank, and my heart skipped a beat. Even though my courage had grown since meeting Elaine, the sight of Dave Swan's condition still made me nearly vomit the breakfast I had just eaten. Dave Swan lay there with his eyes closed, looking like a corpse. His face was ghostly pale, completely devoid of color, and his eye sockets were dark, giving him the appearance of a living dead. The most horrifying part was the tiny black worms crawling in and out of his eyes. Upon closer inspection, I counted 7 or 8 of them. These black worms, about an inch long, had white stripes along their bodies. Some were just poking their heads out of the corner of his left eye, only to quickly retract, and then reappeared from the right eye in a flash, giving anyone who saw it chills down their spine. I grimaced in disgust. This is beyond gross. How on earth does Dave Swan have worms in his eyes? I scanned his body once more, trying to hold back my revulsion. I was so scared that I closed my eyes, but when I opened them again, I saw that Dave Swan's right hand had lost all its flesh, revealing white bones. The 7 or 8 black worms with white stripes were still crawling in and out of his eyes, but Dave Swan lay there without any reaction, resembling a living corpse. The villagers surrounding us couldn't help but sigh. Although Dave Swan wasn't well liked in the village, seeing him in such a miserable state weighed heavily on everyone's hearts. Old Lady Miller, who was usually a bit crazy, was also in the crowd, staring intently while occasionally mumbling something. 2 small yellow dogs were running around, seemingly deep in thought but not saying a word. Seeing Dave Swan's parents in such anguish and Dave Swan lying there, living worse than dead, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of sadness. Suddenly, I recalled the time when Dave Swan had slapped Elaine on the butt and her words, "Sometimes those who take advantage will end up paying a heavy price." Xiao Lian's words had indeed come true. Could it be that Dave Swan was in this predicament because of his own actions? Thinking about how Elaine said she went out to take care of some things last night, I had even more reason to believe that it was Elaine who had turned Dave Swan into this pitiful state. Elaine was so cute, I couldn't help but feel a bit of respect for her. Quick, get the kid a strong and skilled shaman. If we delay any longer, Dave won't survive. Old Man Taylor sighed as he spoke to Richard Swan, Dave Swan's father, who was shedding tears. Richard Swan, who always thought of himself as tough, was now crying silently, as if he had lost all his strength. "Brother Eyre, look at how this child is now. I've lived for decades, and I've never heard of such a disease. Is this some kind of misfortune?" Old Man Taylor gently patted Richard Swan, who was squatting on the ground. "Then we should invite a high-level shaman quickly. Look at those black worms crawling back and forth in Dave's eyes. If this goes on for too long, he'll be finished." Richard Swan felt like his heart was being sliced. His son was his everything. Having a child in his old age, he was already over 30 when Dave Swan was born, and he had always cherished him dearly. Seeing his son in such a state, Richard Swan urgently asked, "Brother Eyre, you often go out and have many contacts. Help me think of someone skilled in magic who can save my son." Speaking of skilled people in our generation, Nelson Anderson, the Taoist from Dai Gu Shan, is the best. "But you know, if you want to ask him." Old Man Taylor hesitated, glancing at Richard Swan. When Richard Swan heard the name Nelson Anderson, he frowned. After pondering for a moment, he waved his hand. "Forget it, his fees are too high." "We can afford the money," Richard Swan said, "but I'm not a virgin daughter to offer him as tribute. I've heard that when he helps others dispel misfortunes, in addition to money, he also insists on having a beautiful girl to sleep with him for one night. Otherwise, even if he keeps you safe at the moment, there will be repercussions later." Old Man Taylor gritted his teeth and replied, "That's true. What can I say about Taoist Chu? His skills are undoubtedly profound, but he certainly lacks morality in this regard." Just then, Old Lady Miller, who had been silent, observed Dave Swan for a while and said, "Why not invite my brother to give it a try?" Everyone's eyes lit up at Old Lady Miller's suggestion. How could we have forgotten about the skilled person so close by? Old Lady Miller had a brother known as Michael Miller, a well-known figure in this generation. If any child was scared, finding him would be better than going to the hospital. It wouldn't necessarily guarantee a cure, but having Michael Miller touch the child's head and recite some incantations would surely help. It was said that Michael Miller had a legendary story in his early years. He was a heavy drinker, indulging in alcohol every day, wandering from village to village. One particularly cold winter, he got drunk and passed out in the wilderness, sleeping one night in the freezing cold, yet miraculously didn't freeze to death. When he returned, he had completely changed. Dave Swan kept babbling all day about how he had a date with the Fox Fairy that night. The Fox Fairy made him her disciple, and now he had taken action. People thought he was crazy or had lost his mind. But after that, Michael Miller indeed seemed to have obtained supernatural powers, and he was the only one in the Northeast who had acquired lightness skill without going through any formal training. He followed two paths. One was the white path, mainly helping people dispel evil and avoid misfortune, quite gentle in nature. The black path, however, was different. No matter what fierce ghost or demon he encountered, as long as he took on the case, he would eliminate the threat completely without leaving any traces behind. Michael Miller walked the black path. Old Lady Miller's words awakened Richard Swan, and his eyes lit up with hope that his son could be saved. Normally, he looked down on this eccentric old woman, but now he saw her as a lifesaver. He turned to Old Lady Miller and said, Sister Miller, if you hadn't mentioned it, I wouldn't have thought of it. Your brother can surely save my son. Whether he can save him or not, we'll see when he arrives, Richard Swan replied. We can't let Dave suffer like this. He quickly called his relatives and friends and hired a cart to go personally invite Michael Miller. Michael Miller lived about 10 miles away from Dragon Harmony Village, which wasn't too far, but the mountain roads were difficult to navigate. Without modern transportation, it would take at least an hour for a round trip. The villagers gathered to see how Michael Miller would save him. I wondered what Elaine was doing at home at that moment. Thinking of Blackie's tragic death. I was worried about the prized pig we just bought for the family. If Elaine ever got a whim to do something to that pig, it would be a disaster. I returned home alone and saw Elaine standing inside, looking at me through the window. When I entered the house, Elaine wanted to shake hands. Is it true that you were touching me yesterday? That guy is sick, isn't he? I asked in surprise. Indeed, Elaine was impressive, she knew what was happening without even needing to see it. I also know that he has black worms crawling in both of his eyes, unable to grasp or kill them. Plus, his right hand is just bones now, Elaine said, revealing a cold smile on her face. Seeing her smile at that moment sent shivers down my spine, reminding me of yesterday when I faced Dave Swan. I trembled as I asked, Elaine, it can't really be you, can it? Elaine smiled even more eerily. Last night, I called a few good friends to help you cut the corn, so you wouldn't have to strain yourself anymore. Then I conveniently visited Dave Swan's house and released a few black worms into his eyes. These black worms, I can grow as many as I want. How do you have so many good friends? I felt uneasy. Elaine's friends surely couldn't be human. They are just like me, all unfortunate wandering souls. Then what happened to Dave Swan's right hand? I noticed that Dave Swan's hand had lost all flesh. The skin and meat on his hand were what I had recorded. Humph, who told him to be so bold as to touch my butt? Elaine said this without a hint of color in her face, but I could see a hint of shyness creeping in. It seemed that even a ghost girl could be shy at times. I realized I needed to reassess Elaine. If it weren't for her excessively cruel methods, she would actually be quite endearing. Elaine once again saw through my thoughts. I had to admit that she was a very clever ghost. Brother C. Guzzi, do you think I'm too cruel and ruthless? Do I scare you? She asked. I nodded, not daring to say another word. Elaine sighed. More than 100 years ago, you and I were both kind-hearted people. But why do good people always get no reward? That wicked woman wronged me, killed both of us, and even skinned me alive, turning my skin into human leather, preventing me from being able to reincarnate on time, making me suffer endless torment. I swear I will not let anyone bully me again. This was the second time I had heard Elaine talk about her past life. It seemed that both of us had indeed been severely wronged. When I asked her what had happened over 100 years ago, Elaine fell silent again, saying that I would understand everything in due time. Right now, my biggest question was, Elaine was a ghost girl. Why do you dare to come out during the day? Aren't ghosts supposed to appear only at night? When I expressed this doubt to Elaine, she replied, when I died, my skin was turned into human leather and bones by a wicked person named Chu, and he placed a curse on my soul, preventing me from ever reincarnating. At first, I could only come out at night. During the early years of the Manhwa dynasty, I encountered a fierce ghost who also couldn't reincarnate. He taught me a method using animal blood. Once every half-month, this way I gained this body without temperature, allowing me to appear during the day. The night you used Blackie's blood, that was a bloodbath. I finally understood why Elaine could do such cruel things. Elaine blushed slightly, and I could tell she regretted hurting my Blackie. Just as we were talking, my mom returned. Upon entering, she sighed and expressed her sympathy for Dave Swan, saying that although the Swan father and son were a bit arrogant because of their wealth, this time it was truly tragic, and it was unbearable to look at. I advised my mom not to worry about other people. After all, Dave Swan was not a good person. Last year, he got Lily pregnant at the east end of the village, and when her parents found out and wanted to marry her off to him because it was already done, he flatly refused. He even claimed that the child in Lily's belly wasn't his, which made her so angry that she ran away from home, and there hadn't been any news since. People with hearts like wolves and lungs like dogs deserve this fate. My mother shook her head. But we shouldn't say that. Let's see if Michael Miller can help him. It's up to his fate. After more than an hour, the sounds of crying and commotion outside continued, making me feel irritated. The Swan family always seemed to love being the center of attention, even with their son in such a state. Instead of keeping him at home, they had to bring him out, causing the entire village to be in chaos. At this moment, the cart that had gone to fetch Michael Miller returned. I wanted to catch a glimpse of his style, so I intended to pull Elaine outside to see the commotion, but Elaine adamantly refused to go, saying she didn't like people like Michael Miller. I had no choice but to go out alone. My mother stayed at home to chat with Elaine. In my mother's eyes, Elaine was undoubtedly a good girl, and it would be even better if she could be her daughter-in-law. At this time, almost all the villagers had gathered around. Everyone stared wide-eyed at Michael Miller as he approached the cart. I looked at the old man and noticed he didn't have 3 heads and 6 arms. How had everyone made him out to be so extraordinary? Michael Miller showed good professionalism. As soon as he got off the cart, he hurried to Dave Swan and asked, "Is this the child?" Richard Swan quickly approached and handed Michael Miller a cigarette, saying, "Mr. Miller, please help us and take a good look. What exactly is wrong with this child? How could he change so much in just one night?" Michael Miller crouched down to examine him closely. Michael Miller bit his lower lip tightly, remaining silent for a long time. He didn't speak, and others didn't dare to ask. Everyone quietly watched him, waiting to see how he would treat this bizarre illness. I saw Michael Miller extend his calloused hands and pull back Dave Swan's eyelid. The crowd followed his gaze, noticing several black worms wriggling in one of Dave Swan's eyes. These black worms stood out against the shiny eyeball, creating a strikingly eerie image. The entire body of these harmful worms was covered with white stripes that glimmered like silver. Upon closer inspection, the black worms resembled small earthworms, swimming back and forth in Dave Swan's eye, unwillingly opening their tiny mouths to nibble at his pupil. Now, Dave Swan's pupil was barely half its original size. Many villagers who witnessed this scene felt disgusted, opening their mouths and vomiting up everything they had eaten that morning. "Mr. Miller, what kind of worms are these? They're about to eat my son's eyeball. You need to think of something fast," Richard Swan said with a choked voice, worried about his son's safety. Michael Miller had seen many alarming situations, but today, facing these strange black worms, he broke out in a cold sweat, his hands trembling slightly as he held the eyelid. "Oh, Swan, your son is in serious trouble. Mr. Miller, don't joke around. My wife and I only have this one son. If anything happens to him, what's the point of me living?" Richard Swan said. When his wife heard that their son was in danger, she knelt on the ground, crying and begging Michael Miller. "Mr. Miller, I will give you more money, please save my son." Saying this, Richard Swan pulled out 1,000 yuan and stuffed it into Michael Miller's coat pocket. Michael Miller had come a long way, probably just for the money. Seeing Richard Swan being so generous, despite knowing the black worms were very dangerous, he had to grit his teeth and take action. He rolled up his sleeves, used his left thumb and index finger to pull Dave Swan's eyelid apart, and placed his right hand at the corner of his eye, beginning his work. Richard Swan's wife, unreasonably crying, said, "Mr. Miller, look at my son's hand, the bones are all exposed. Is there any medicine you can give him?" Michael Miller, focused on preparing to catch the worms, felt anger rise and snapped, "Do you really think of me as a deity? The flesh can't grow back. If I can get these worms out, that will be a stroke of luck. At least I can save his life. These black worms eat human flesh, if we wait any longer, they'll crawl into his brain and eat it clean. Hearing this, the faces of everyone present changed color. Everyone had just witnessed the black worms devouring Dave Swan's eyeball, so they fully believed what Michael Miller said. No one dared to disturb him while he was catching the worms anymore. The crowd held their breath, wide-eyed, afraid that a loud breath would scare the worms away. Time passed second by second. Suddenly, Michael Miller shouted, "Hey!" Along with his shout, he pinched a black worm that had just poked its head out with 2 fingers of his right hand, swiftly pulling it out of Dave Swan's eye. Michael Miller looked pleased, glancing at the black worms around, muttering to himself, "After so many years of storms, I've never seen anything like this." But before he could finish, he suddenly let out a strange cry. The black worm in his hand unexpectedly shed its outer skin and flew out like a cicada shedding its shell. The worm that flew out was silvery white and flew towards Michael Miller's face at an incredible speed, diving straight into his flesh in the blink of an eye. Michael Miller was caught off guard, the distance was too close, and the speed of the worm's flight was extremely fast. He wanted to dodge, but it was too late. "Oh no," he shouted, hurriedly covering his face with his hand. His fingers brushed over the area where the worm had burrowed in. However, it was futile. Michael Miller felt an unbearable itch and began to writhe in pain. Within half a minute, he was rolling on the ground in agony. The villagers surrounding him were all pale with fear, as this sudden change left them stunned. Michael Miller was a notable figure in this area. The fact that even he fell victim to these worms was truly unbelievable. Michael Miller was rolling on the ground, unable to bear the excruciating pain. He pulled out a sharp knife from his chest, and with determination, he shouted as he sliced off a piece of flesh from his face. After a scream of agony, he let go. I watched closely from the side, without a word of protest. Michael Miller's face now had a missing chunk, and the area where the flesh was missing had a gaping wound oozing blood. At that moment, blood flowed from his face down his neck. True to his reputation as an old hand, Michael Miller remained calm even in such painful torment. He tore off a corner of his shirt and tightly pressed it against the bleeding wound. Looking at the piece of flesh he had just cut, a silver worm was greedily gnawing at it, consuming the flesh bite by bite, and gradually growing larger. Before long, it had completely devoured the piece of flesh. This silver worm had now grown to the thickness of a finger. It wobbled on the ground, its plump body rolling around. Suddenly, it crawled onto Michael Miller's foot. He knew very well how formidable this white worm was. Even though he was wearing shoes, he didn't dare to guarantee that his foot was safe. In a moment of panic, he violently shook his foot, trying to quickly shake off this deadly creature. Although he was round and plump, Michael Miller was not clumsy at all. His belly had a pair of small legs, and dozens of little legs were neatly arranged, tightly sticking to the top of Michael Miller's foot. Despite using all his strength, he couldn't shake the white worm off. The fat white worm was gnawing at his cloth shoe with its tiny mouth. At that moment, Michael Miller could no longer maintain his dignified demeanor. He exclaimed, "Oh my," and kicked off the shoe from his other foot, finally managing to remove it. Immediately afterward, Michael Miller decisively stepped down on the white worm, squashing it into pieces. Looking down, he saw the white fluid flowing out from the worm all over the ground. This nauseating fluid was mixed with some reddish-brown blood, making one think of the piece of flesh that had been eaten from Michael Miller's face. Michael Miller exhaled deeply. That was close. If I hadn't insisted on pulling off this piece of flesh and cutting it, I probably wouldn't have a face left at all. Mr. Miller, if you can't even deal with these damned worms, you must save my son. Richard Swan was pale from the earlier gruesome scene, but he was now solely focused on saving his son. He clutched Michael Miller's hand, pleading desperately. Michael Miller shook his hand, his goatee twitching as he said, "Oh, Swan, it's not that I'm not trying hard, but your son has indeed been harmed by filthy things. From what I see, the filthy thing that harmed your son has at least been cultivating for hundreds of years. I truly cannot contend with it. You should seek someone more capable." As he spoke, Michael Miller returned the 1,000 yuan he had pocketed back to Richard Swan, then turned and walked towards the village entrance. Richard Swan and his wife were crying bitterly, looking at Dave Swan lying on the wooden plank, resembling a corpse, too afraid to approach because of the black worms crawling in and out of his eyes. Michael Miller hurriedly walked towards the village entrance, as if fleeing for his life. Old Lady Miller, who had been watching from the sidelines, jogged up to him. "Sir, I know who caused these worms," she said, pointing towards my house. "It's Nguyen Tu's family. Recently, a new person has come to their house." Before Miller could finish her sentence, Michael Miller covered her mouth with his hand. "You don't need to say, I already know. The problem lies with that person here. Listen to me, girl, from now on, you must never mention this again. Keep your distance from that filthy thing, and do not get involved with him, do you hear?" Miller had never seen Michael Miller this anxious before, and she realized the seriousness of the situation. She nodded her head in agreement. Michael Miller said no more and hurriedly left Dragon Harmony Village. With the departure of the man everyone saw as a sage, Richard Swan completely lost his anchor, feeling that his son was doomed. Now he was filled with despair, like a wandering corpse. It was only a matter of time before preparing for Dave Swan's funeral. As I looked at Dave Swan lying there, I felt a bit uneasy. Although the kid was a bit mischievous, was what Elaine was doing too much? Everyone has different ways of thinking and dealing with things, especially Elaine, who was just a resentful female ghost. Perhaps the harm she suffered over 100 years ago had made her desire for revenge so strong. Sigh, although Elaine is quite pitiful, I still have to find a way to get her away. If she stays in my house, unpredictable consequences will definitely happen. At that moment, Jack Taylor's 5.5-year-old grandson suddenly pointed and shouted, "Look, the black worms in Uncle Jengun's eyes have grown this big." I looked at Dave Swan's eyes and was taken aback. Those few black worms crawling in and out of his eyes were now twice as thick as before. Dave Swan still had his eyes tightly shut, and his eyelids were visibly sagging. It was obvious what was happening, his eyeballs were almost eaten away by the black worms. At this point, don't worry about how many people are around, Hai Tai, quickly go to Dai Gu Shan to find Taoist Chu Nelson. He needs a young girl to sleep with him, just spend a little more money to find one. If this continues, Dave Swan will surely die. Jack Taylor said anxiously, while Richard Swan stared blankly, nodding in agreement. Good, good, but just as Richard Swan was preparing to head to Dai Gu Shan, everyone present clearly heard a few soft popping sounds coming from Dave Swan's body. Looking closely, it could scare the timid ones out of their pants. Brain matter was oozing out from Dave Swan's ears and mouth. After a while, the matter also began to seep out from his nose and eyes, quickly creating a puddle on the ground. The air was suddenly filled with a foul smell of blood. Miller Ba, showing some courage, walked closer to take a look and turned back to the crowd, saying regretfully, "It's over. This boy's 7 orifices have been eaten by worms, his brains are gone." Looking around Dave Swan's head, it was true, there was a pool of brain matter surrounding him. He must have been empty-headed by now. I couldn't bear to watch any longer, feeling nauseous, and quietly headed home. During the 2 days that Elaine stayed at my house, she had already gotten along very well with my mother. When I returned, I saw them chatting happily. I was increasingly impressed with my mother for having so much in common with a female ghost. That night, Richard Swan set up a tent in his yard and even invited a group of musicians who played the swona from town. This group was highly skilled, their tunes were sorrowful and haunting, evoking a feeling of melancholy. Richard Swan also invited a few monks to come to his house to chant scriptures. The ritual for the deceased in Halong was quite a novelty. Most people had never seen what a monk looked like, so they rushed to the Swan family to see the commotion. One reason was to bring some money paper to burn, and the other was to see how the monk chanted. Before dark, my mother bought a bundle of money paper and told me to take it over there tonight. Seeing that the Swan family had started preparing for the funeral, I picked up the bundle of money paper and stepped out of my room, ready to deliver it. As I stood in the hallway, I noticed the door to Elaine's room was slightly ajar, and it was pitch black inside with no lights on. I wondered what she was doing in there that was so quiet. Although I had come to accept that Elaine was a female ghost over the past 2 days, and I was no longer as fearful as I had been at the beginning, it was still night, and there was a female ghost in that dark room. Any little sound made my heart race. The quieter the room was, the more curious I became to find out what she was doing in there. I summoned my courage, gently pushed the door open, and called softly, "Elaine, Elaine, are you in there?" The room was empty, and the quilt on the bed was neatly folded, with the entire space being very clean. I scanned the room and confirmed that Elaine was indeed not there. Where could she have gone? Did she go outside to take a bath again? Just as I was about to leave the room, I suddenly noticed a note lying on the bed. It was written in small, neat characters, "There is a monk chanting tonight." I couldn't stand it and went to my sister's place. "Don't worry about me, Elaine." I stood there holding the note, unsure whether to laugh or cry. I closed Elaine's door and took the bundle of money paper to Richard Swan's house. Each family in the village sent a representative, some brought money paper, some dropped off some cash, and some older folks consoled Richard Swan, urging him to keep his spirits up. At that moment, a scruffy old Taoist dressed in blue walked into the yard. As soon as he entered, he attracted the attention of most people in the yard. His hair was messy, looking like it hadn't been washed in at least 3 months. His gray Taoist robe had several large holes, and it was clear that he had worn this outfit for many years. One could tell he was a wandering old Taoist, seeking alms. As soon as he entered the yard, he inquired about who the owner of the house was. When someone guided him to meet Richard Swan, the old Taoist clasped his palms together in greeting and said, "Vo Luong Thien Tun, this benefactor, life and death are predetermined, wealth and nobility are in the heavens." "It's just unfortunate, it's also fate," the old Taoist said. "I hope you keep your spirits up. Could you spare me a simple meal?" Richard Swan, who had always been stingy, was now in deep sorrow. Seeing the old Taoist in such a disheveled state made him even more irritable. He impatiently replied, "Don't bother me, don't be annoying. Do you want me to give you some dung or not?" Upon hearing this, the old Taoist paused for a moment but didn't get angry. His dirty face remained smiling as he stepped aside, no longer speaking. This was the first time I had seen the legendary Taoist, and out of curiosity, I looked at him a few more times. He left a deep impression on me. Despite being dirty and ragged, he had an air of dignity and grace. At that moment, he was also looking at me meaningfully. Among the hundreds of people in the yard, it seemed like he was particularly interested in me. I felt a bit confused, thinking to myself why this old man, who I had never met before, was staring at me. I dropped the money paper. The sorrowful atmosphere in the Swan family made me feel uncomfortable all over. Besides, Dave Swan's death was directly related to Elaine. Elaine was still staying at my house. Thinking of this, I felt inexplicably guilty and just wanted to leave the Swan family as soon as possible. However, when I approached the coffin containing Dave Swan's body, suddenly a dark object sprang out from the shadows and jumped onto the coffin lid. I stepped back and with a whoosh, something flew past me, leaving behind a sharp and piercing cry, "Meow." At that moment, my heart flipped, and I almost shouted out loud. Looking closely at the object that passed in front of me, I realized it was a large black cat. I couldn't comprehend the dangers here, but many villagers clearly understood. Cats are said to have spiritual connections, especially black cats. If they disturb the spirit of a recently deceased person, there's a high chance it could lead to a zombie resurrection. My heart raced, I had indeed been frightened by this large black cat. Just then, Jack Taylor quickly called for the Swana band to stop and pulled Richard Swan to the coffin. "Hi Tai, that black cat just jumped over the coffin lid, this is very ominous. If we're not careful, it could prevent Dave Swan's soul from resting peacefully. If he rises again, that would be disastrous." Jack Taylor was quite experienced and had a reputation in how long Richard Swan had always trusted his words. "Is it really that serious? What should we do? We need to find a good yin-yang master to exorcise it, just in case." Upon hearing this, I thought to myself that I really couldn't stay here any longer. When Dave Swan was still alive, he had scared everyone, and now that he was dead, there was even a possibility of him rising again. This was truly a dire situation. Just as I turned to leave, a rustling sound came from the coffin. In the yard, the sound of the Swana was gone. The sound of the monk chanting was clear in the silent night. The people standing nearby began to feel tense. Could it really be true, as Jack Taylor had said, that Dave Swan was unwilling to rest and wanted to rise again? The rustling sound resembled someone scratching the coffin lid with their nails. In this coffin, it was clear that only Dave Swan was inside. Was he really trying to cause trouble from within? The crowd began to lose interest, not daring to approach. Richard Swan reached out, supporting the lid that had yet to be nailed down, calling into the coffin, "Jen Gun, please go ahead, don't suffer anymore. If you need to be reborn, then go. If you have anything to do, do it. You're dead now, so don't cause any more trouble for your father." After calling for a while, there was no response from inside the coffin. The rustling sound became even clearer. I paused, imagining Dave Swan scratching the inside of the coffin with his nails, to the point where his fingers would be bloody. I took a deep breath, not daring to think any further. At that moment, I suddenly noticed that only one person in the room had a calm and composed expression, and that was the scruffy old Taoist. He stood in an inconspicuous corner, his demeanor relaxed and carefree. Humans have an innate curiosity about the unknown, and everyone present was eager to know what was happening. What was happening inside the coffin was a mystery, but no one dared to approach, fearing that Dave Swan would suddenly jump up and choke someone. At that moment, Richard Swan took on the role of a hero. After all, it was his son lying in the coffin, so his fear was less than that of the others. He slowly pushed open the coffin lid. The electric light had already been set up inside, and when he looked into the coffin under the dim light, Richard Swan first widened his eyes in shock, then his expression turned to one of unbearable pain as he screamed, "Damn it," and sat down hard on the ground. After a long pause, the others, led by the braver Jack Taylor, moved closer to the coffin to see what was inside. I also mustered up the courage to take a peek from the outside. This glimpse made me shiver all over. It was too tragic. Inside the coffin, the body of Dave Swan was devoid of any skin, leaving only a terrifying white skeleton that made one's hair stand on end. Beside his bones, a large-headed creature was happily gnawing on the remaining flesh of his arm. This creature was covered in blood as it devoured, occasionally extending its green, slimy tongue to lick its lips, leaving more bloodstains on the coffin's interior. Seeing this scene, even the usually composed Jack Taylor couldn't suppress his inner fear. The dozen people surrounding the coffin let out a collective scream and scattered in panic. I couldn't understand why I was so unfortunate. I wasn't standing in the front row, but the fleeing crowd pushed me to the front. As I stepped on a banana peel, who knew which rascal had thrown it down, I lost my balance and was shoved into the coffin. My mind went blank, and I nearly fainted, my entire body landing on Dave Swan's cold skeleton, even breaking 2 of his ribs. The creature that had been feeding on Dave Swan was now just inches away from me. I could see its face clearly. It was a creature with only half a body, resembling a person closely, with long black hair that hung down its shoulders. Its arms were thin and long, able to support its half body while jumping around. At that moment, we were face to face, staring into each other's eyes. Because the space in the coffin was too cramped, my face was almost pressed against its face. I could clearly see that its face resembled that of an elderly woman, covered in wrinkles, yet extremely pale. The blood from the decomposed body added to its grotesque appearance. This time, unusually, I did not scream. It wasn't that I was brave, I was too scared to make a sound. Sweat dripped down my face, soaking my clothes. I had no idea who had pushed me into the coffin. Was this a death sentence for me? The half-bodied creature studied me for a moment and suddenly extended its green tongue to lick my face. I stepped back, hitting my head hard against the coffin lid, feeling dizzy for a moment. When I saw the monster, it opened its gaping mouth towards my face. The stench of its drunken breath nearly suffocated me on the spot. In that critical moment, a large hand suddenly pressed down on the monster's head, gripping its long hair. The owner of this grotesque creature, the scruffy old Taoist, reached out with his other hand to grab my belt and forcefully pulled me out of the coffin. I was terrified and felt like my soul had left my body. Once I stood up, I looked at the person who had saved me. It was the old Taoist who had been silently standing in the corner. The old man held the monster by its hair and muttered, "This kind of creature comes out to harm people. Look at your green tongue, you must have eaten at least 3 people. Today, I will exorcise you." As soon as he finished speaking, the old man pulled a layer of talismans from his filthy robe and stuck it on the monster's forehead. The creature howled loudly, its small eyes gleaming with malice, preparing to strike at the old Taoist. The old man pointed at the swelling on the monster's forehead and began to chant an incantation. The creature immediately stiffened, and gradually its body turned to ash and disappeared completely. The old Taoist tossed the monster aside and wiped his dirty hands on his robe as if washing them off. The crowd, still in shock, gathered around the old Taoist. Richard Swan now approached the old man respectfully, realizing that this dirty old Taoist was a remarkable figure. "Master, what kind of monster is this? Why is it so terrifying?" Jack Taylor asked the old man. "This is a creature that has reached a certain level. Those who die with disabilities are prone to turning into such malevolent spirits. They feed on corpses to cultivate. Once they have eaten a sufficient number of corpses, they will become vengeful spirits, and at that point, they will be very difficult to reclaim." The old man spoke calmly. Hearing this, the crowd was left dumbfounded, nodding repeatedly. Then the old Taoist leaned towards me. "Young brother, I saved your life. May I invite you to your home for a meal?" Before I could respond, Richard Swan quickly started flattering the old Taoist. "Oh, master, it was my fault for not recognizing your greatness earlier. Please, come eat at my house. I'll prepare the best food for you." Everyone could see that Swan's house was filled with strange happenings today. Now that they had finally encountered such a figure, they certainly did not want to let this opportunity slip away and were eager to please the old Taoist. However, the old Taoist seemed uninterested in his flattery, shaking his head. I quickly said, "Master, you saved my life. I, Li Ying, will repay you, so please come to my house." Hearing this, the old Taoist smiled with satisfaction. "That's just wonderful." I led the old man to my house, and upon arriving, I told my mother about the thrilling scenes at Swan's house. My mother was startled too when she heard that. She warmly invited the old Taoist to sit down and went to the kitchen to prepare a meal. In the room, it was just the two of us, and the atmosphere grew serious. "Little brother, tell me the truth. Has anything strange happened at home recently?" The old man's sudden question caught me off guard. I didn't expect him to ask that. Not only had strange things been happening at home, but I had also seen a ghost. I stuttered for a while but couldn't bring myself to tell the old man the truth. I didn't know how deep the old Taoist's knowledge ran. If I told him about Elaine, he might feel compelled by his profession to exorcise her. Elaine was so cute, I doubted the old Taoist could even handle her. If that happened, and Elaine introduced me, I'd be in big trouble. Thinking of this, I replied, no, nothing's happening. Everything is normal. The old Taoist suddenly smiled coldly, pulled my hand, and stood me up, dragging me to Elaine's room. Once inside, he pointed and said, "There is a very fierce ghostly energy in this room." At this point, 7 fierce ghosts finally entered the village to check the situation. Between me and the old Taoist, he suggested that I cooperate with him to get rid of the female ghost together. I shook my head in response. "Master, is there any other way? Or could you talk to her and ask her to leave my house? Just stop bothering me." "Ha ha ha, you think too simply, little brother. Since this fierce ghost has come looking for you, there must be a reason. Do you really think that with just a few words from me, she will leave?" After saying this, the old Taoist reached into his robe and pulled out several pre-written talismans, covered in strange symbols I couldn't understand at all. He stuck one talisman on the door frame of the previous room, then led me outside to stick one on each side of the main door. "She hasn't said when she will come back," I replied. "Oh, she might not come back tonight. She said there would be monks chanting, and she couldn't stand it." I still have things to do. Elaine is at her friend's house. Just remember not to let these talismans fall." After finishing, the old Taoist pushed open the door and walked out. My mother had just finished cooking and was bringing it in when she saw the old man leaving. She said, "Master, please eat before you go." The old man didn't turn back, his solitary figure disappearing into the night. I returned to my room, lying on the bed, feeling confused, unsure if encountering this skilled Taoist was a blessing or a curse. The fact that he had put up those 3 talismans was definitely not good for Elaine. If he came back and saw me colluding with outsiders to harm her, who knows how he would react. I thought about going outside to tear down those talismans, but the old man's warning still kept me from doing so. I silently thought, "Elaine, please don't blame me. I just want you to stay away from me, to stop clinging to me. Even if, according to what you said, it seems we loved each other in a past life, but now you are a ghost and I am a human, we cannot be together." The more I thought about this, the more restless I became, and I lost my appetite for dinner. I lay down and fell into a deep sleep. When I woke up, it was already past 8 a.m. After days of being on edge, I finally had a good sleep. What I cared about most now was whether Elaine had returned. I walked to her room and saw she still hadn't come back. At this time, Richard Swan's family had begun to organize a funeral for Dave Swan. According to tradition, the body should be kept for at least 3 days for the funeral, but a series of troubles had occurred. Richard Swan was already mentally and physically exhausted, just wanting his son to be buried peacefully. Early in the morning, he had hired a freight truck to take Dave Swan's body to the crematorium in the county. Old Lady Swan also didn't come out to tell ghost stories to everyone. Every time I saw her, her small yellow eyes. I returned to my room, lying on the bed, feeling a mess inside. I didn't know whether encountering this highly skilled Taoist was a blessing or a curse. The old man had put up those 3 talismans, which surely were not favorable for Elaine. If he came back and saw me conspiring with outsiders to harm her, wouldn't he turn against me? I thought about going outside to tear down those talismans, but recalling what the Taoist said before leaving, I held back. In my heart, I silently thought, "Elaine, please don't blame me. I just want you to stay away from me, I don't want you to cling to me. Although according to what you said, it seems that in a past life we were in love, now you are a ghost and I am a human. We can't be together." The more I thought about this, the more anxious I became, and I lost my appetite for dinner. I eventually fell into a deep sleep. When I woke up, it was already past 8 a.m. After days of high tension, I finally had a good night's sleep. The thing I cared about most now was whether Elaine had returned. I walked to her room and was relieved to find she still wasn't back. At that moment, the Swan family had begun preparations for Dave's funeral. According to funeral customs, the body must be kept for at least 3 days before burial. However, several problems had arisen one after another, and Richard Swan was mentally and physically exhausted, just wishing for his son to be laid to rest soon. Early in the morning, he hired a truck to take Dave's body to the crematorium in the county. Old Lady Miller also did not come out to tell ghost stories to everyone. Each time I saw her, I always felt that the old Lady Miller was staring in the direction of my house, and my intuition told me she probably knew what was going on with Elaine. The whole village of Dragon Harmony Village was now engulfed in panic. The villagers were discussing among themselves, saying that Dave had died in such a bizarre manner that they had never seen before. Some said it was definitely because the ancestors of the Liu family had done bad deeds, and Richard Swan was not a good father either. This was divine retribution, and Dave's fate was a punishment. Only I knew how Dave had died. Looking at the 3 talismans the old Taoist had posted in my house, I wished Elaine wouldn't come back to find me. I was just a simple villager and couldn't withstand her disturbances. I spent the whole day in torment. As the sun set, my heart became even more chaotic because it was very likely that Elaine would return tonight. The old Taoist had also promised me that he would come tonight to subdue Elaine. When night fell, I locked the main door tightly. I knew this wouldn't do much, but at least it provided some comfort. It was already 9 p.m., and there was not a sound outside. I thought maybe Elaine had heard something and wouldn't come back. That would be great. Otherwise, if she returned and saw these talismans, wouldn't she treat me like she did Blackie and take my blood? Time passed slowly, and my heart was under immense pressure. There wasn't much entertainment in the village, and people slept early. Now, my mother was already asleep, and I was alone in the dark room, occasionally glancing out the window. I didn't know whether tonight would bring good or bad fortune. The moonlight outside was dim, and the autumn wind rustled, occasionally stirring some dry leaves. I could hear a few wild cats calling, which made my heart feel uneasy. Just when I was nervously huddled in my room, suddenly, there was a knock at the door. My heart leaped into my throat. Could it be Elaine coming back? Then I thought, it couldn't be. Elaine wouldn't need to knock, she could simply fly into the yard. It must be the old Taoist coming. Thinking this, I gently pushed open the door and walked to the yard to open the main door. Who is it? I called from outside. It's me, the Taoist who came yesterday. Hearing that it was indeed him calmed my heart a bit. I opened the door to find the old Taoist still dressed the same way as last night, in his tattered robe, which danced in the autumn wind. Ah, Taoist, please come in and talk. I pulled him into the yard and whispered, Taoist, my mother is easily scared, so let's be gentle. Please don't wake her up. If she gets agitated, please don't mention that there's a female ghost in my house. I threw him into the room and poured him a cup of hot water. The Taoist didn't stand on ceremony, lifting the cup and taking a sip. Is there any old glutinous rice at home? Ah, no, Taoist. What do you need that for? To drink back in Australia? You really think I'm a beggar? Later when that female ghost comes back, glutinous rice could come in handy. But if you don't have any, that's fine. Is there a black dog? When it comes back, we can take some black dog blood to deal with it. Taoist, there used to be a black dog, but it was killed by that female ghost a couple of days ago. The blood of that dog has already been used. What? When the old Taoist heard this, his face immediately changed. He couldn't sit still on the bed anymore and got up, walking back and forth in the room with a very serious expression. I thought to myself, what's wrong with this old Taoist? Why such a big reaction when he hears that Elaine killed the black dog? After a while, the old Taoist finally spoke, this is not good. The female ghost that has come to your home doesn't even fear black dog blood. It seems she has cultivated to a certain level, she is a fierce ghost. I didn't feel surprised upon hearing this. Elaine was indeed very strong, I was well aware of that. Not to mention the vicious methods she used to kill Blackie, the black worms in Dave Swan's eyes were also raised by Elaine. The old Taoist said nothing further, took out special paper and brushes, and began to concentrate on drawing some talismans on the bed. After finishing the drawings, he tucked them into his pocket. I quietly stayed in the room, observing the movements outside. Time passed by second, and Elaine still hadn't returned. I thought maybe Elaine, having cultivated for many years, knew it was dangerous to come back tonight and wouldn't return. But seeing that the old Taoist was fully prepared, he seemed quite certain that Elaine would return tonight. I silently prayed, hoping that Elaine wouldn't come back to find me. If that happened, it would be good for both of us. But life is often like this, most of the time, it goes against people's wishes. Around 11 p.m., a tall girl with a delicate appearance walked through the gate, still wearing a pink top and blue jeans, moving lightly as if her footsteps barely touched the ground. When I saw her, my heart tightened sharply. It was Elaine who had entered. As soon as the old Taoist saw Elaine walk in, his dark eyes suddenly shone brightly, staring intently at her. When Elaine entered the door, as if sensing something was wrong, just as she was about to turn around, the talismans that the old Taoist had posted on both sides of the door suddenly shot out two beams of blinding light directly at Elaine. Elaine swiftly turned, desperately trying to dodge the two beams of light, but it was too late, she was struck squarely. She let out a painful scream, and that scream was completely different from her usual melodious voice, it was piercing and ear-piercingly distressing. She crouched down in pain, reaching out to cover her back where she had been hit by the bright light. Elaine looked very sorrowful with her pale face. The two talismans continued to emit bright light, eventually forming a circle of light that surrounded her entire body, rendering her immobile. The old Taoist saw that the time was right, jumped out of the window, and landed in the courtyard with swift movements. However, the robe he wore was too loose, causing him to knock over a flower pot from my windowsill, shattering it completely. I thought to myself, oh my, why is this old Taoist pretending to be a martial arts master? Walking out the door would tire him out. I quickly walked from the house to the yard. At this point, I was not very confident in this old Taoist. If he struggled to jump out of the window, could he really be a match for Elaine? If he couldn't handle her tonight, she might unleash her wrath and take us both down. By this time, the old Taoist had reached Elaine. Seeing her trapped by the talisman and unable to move, he sighed. You, ghost girl, why won't you properly reincarnate as a human and instead choose to harm others? Your sins are deep, I cannot let you go. I will disperse your soul now so you won't linger in the human realm. As he spoke, he extended two fingers to form a gesture and closed his eyes, muttering a spell. Suddenly, he opened his eyes and shouted, pointing his fingers at Elaine's crown. I could no longer bear to watch. I turned my head away, feeling very uneasy. Seeing how effective the talismans were from the old Taoist, it must mean his Taoist skills are quite high. This time, Elaine would surely be left without a soul. For some reason, at this moment, I actually felt a bit sorry for her. Thinking about the days I had encountered her, she had never harmed me. She had only done things out of desperation. As for killing Dave, although it was a bit cruel, Dave wasn't exactly an innocent person either. He kind of brought it on himself. Just when I thought Elaine was bound to lose her soul, I suddenly heard a loud crash. Bang! The sound startled me. Tears streamed down my face, and seeing that made my heart ache. The old Taoist, upon witnessing this scene, was equally astonished. In my lifetime, I have dealt with countless spirits, but I have never seen such a bizarre occurrence. It's truly incredible. After saying this, he did not immediately disperse Elaine's soul but instead lifted her off the ground and brought her into the house. I hurriedly followed him inside, watching as Elaine lay limp in his grasp, motionless. Guilt began to swell within me. Elaine had mentioned that she came to find me because we were lovers in a past life. Over 100 years ago, both of us had suffered at the hands of others. She sought me out to revive old feelings, while I was aiding this Taoist against her. What kind of man am I? The more I thought about it, the more I felt sorry for Elaine. Although she was just a ghost, what of it? There are many evildoers in this world who are worse than ghosts. At least Elaine was loyal and cherished our past bond. Thinking of this, my heart felt as if it were being torn apart. I regretted not having chased this Taoist out of my home when I had the chance. Once inside, the Taoist tossed Elaine onto the bed and pulled up a chair to sit, examining the motionless Elaine. At that moment, I truly wanted to rush over, tear the talisman from her forehead, drive the Taoist away, and tell Elaine that none of this was my intention. But just as I gathered the courage to step forward, Elaine suddenly spoke. Taoist, before you let my soul scatter into pieces, could you first listen to the grievances in my heart? Elaine lay on his side on the bed, his voice weak. It was clear that the unease on his forehead made him restless. Old Taoist priest nodded, this is still the first time I've seen a ghost shed tears. I reckon you must have a very significant reason, otherwise I would have already shattered your soul, making you disappear from this world. Elaine mustered strength and spoke, Taoist, let me finish what I have in my heart, then let me say a few words to Billy, and after that, you can deal with me as you please. Hearing this, old Taoist priest seemed intrigued, then hurry up and say it, after that, I'll send you on your way. Hearing Elaine's words, I felt warmth in my heart. Even at this point, he still remembered me. It felt like there was sand blowing into my eyes. Hearing old Taoist priest say he would send him on his way, I was furious, that shaggy-haired Taoist, I'll send your entire family on their way. Tonight, if you touch a single hair on Elaine, I won't let you go. Elaine looked at me with clear, sorrowful eyes and finally began to recount the horrific events that happened 127 years ago. Over 100 years ago, during the late Qing dynasty, in a village called Wilson Family Village in Baoding, Hebei, Elaine and my past incarnation both lived in that village. My past incarnation was a famous healer known throughout the area. Thanks to my skills in healing, I was able to live comfortably even through heavy rains. Elaine, on the other hand, had a rather poor family background. Her parents were honest and humble people. I was only a year older than Elaine, and we grew up in the same village, having admired each other for a long time. It could be said that we were childhood sweethearts. In those turbulent times, even if there was mutual affection between a man and a woman, they still had to be mindful of the gossip behind their backs. Elaine and I always kept our distance, not daring to get too close, afraid of provoking idle talk. The head of Wilson Family Village was named Hawk Wilson. Since the Wilson family was a prominent clan in the area, he needed to have a certain leadership ability. It was said that he had passed the Shiotsuai exam in his youth, which is why he was recognized as the head of the village. Hawk Wilson had a daughter named Stacy Wilson, who was as beautiful as a flower, alluring, but with a heart like a snake. Stacy Wilson was extremely jealous. Whenever she saw a girl prettier than herself, she hated them intensely, wishing to get rid of them. Not only was she vicious, but Stacy Wilson also relied on her father's position to act arrogantly in the village. Originally, Stacy Wilson had married into an Anderson family in the village, but she still had an illicit affair with her cousin. Her cousin also lived in Wilson Family Village, and the two were openly like a couple, living like lovers. Stacy Wilson's husband, fearing her father Hawk Wilson as the village leader, knew his wife was unfaithful but did not dare to act out, swallowing his anger in silence. At that time, Elaine was in her youth. Elaine was as beautiful as a freshly bloomed lotus. Meanwhile, Stacy Wilson's cousin was a devil among flowers, and had long lusted after Elaine. One evening, Elaine had just returned from the mountains after picking herbs for her seriously ill mother, when she met Stacy Wilson's cousin at the village entrance. This beast, seeing Elaine, got extremely excited. Seeing no one around, he grabbed Elaine and started to make inappropriate moves. Elaine resisted with all her strength and cried out for help. Eventually, two villagers returning to the village discovered them and took both of them to Hawk Wilson, the village head. Hawk Wilson, seeing his own nephew, asked what happened, and after understanding, this old man made up his mind to advise Elaine to let it go, as if nothing had happened. Those two villagers were also named Wilson, so they naturally sided with Hawk Wilson and also advised Elaine not to escalate the matter. Elaine considered that such a matter, if revealed, would be quite humiliating, so she agreed. But things were far from that simple. Stacy Wilson happened to be staying at her parents' house that day. Hearing the commotion, she put on her clothes and came out to see what was going on. The moment she saw Elaine, she became furious. Elaine's beauty had long irked her. When she heard that her lecherous cousin had been caught harassing Elaine, she grew even more resentful of Elaine. The cunning Stacy Wilson had an idea and immediately said to her cousin, "Cousin, did Elaine seduce you?" While saying this, she winked at her cousin. Her cousin understood her meaning right away and quickly echoed, "Ah, yes. When I reached the village entrance, I met Elaine. This girl insisted that she liked me and wanted to marry me. Well, did she ever have anything with you before?" Stacy Wilson's cousin, an unashamed liar, didn't even blush when he lied. "Over in the pile of firewood in the village, she had some fun times with me. But it was all because she seduced me, not the other way around." Elaine heard this and was both anxious and angry, her face turning red all the way to her neck, repeatedly explaining, "No, it's not like that." Stacy Wilson rushed over and slapped Elaine several times, cursing her, "You filthy, shameless little wench, you've disgraced Wilson family village. You saw my cousin was handsome, and you seduced him. Let's see how we deal with you today." After that, Stacy Wilson went up to her father, Hawk Wilson, and said, "Father, such lowly women, according to the rules of Wilson family village, should be put into the pig cage." In fact, Hawk Wilson had seen everything clearly. Who was right and who was wrong, he knew better than anyone else. The old man wore a sinister smile and spoke to everyone in the room, "All of you leave. What happened tonight must not be mentioned to outsiders." The village head's words carried weight, and Stacy Wilson, her cousin, and the two Wilson villagers all withdrew. Hawk Wilson walked up to Elaine with a lecherous grin. "Elaine, you have done such an improper thing. You want pig cage, huh? Such a beautiful girl, what a pity." Hawk Wilson said, lifting Elaine's chin with his hand, staring at her face with a smile. Elaine pushed Hawk Wilson's hand away, shouting loudly, "It's not like that. It was Stacy Wilson's cousin who harassed me. They are falsely accusing me together." Hawk Wilson's face darkened. "You brat, let me tell you the truth. If you want to live, become my fourth concubine. I will protect you, nothing will happen to you. If not, HMPF, I'll put you in the pig cage, and you'll lose everything." Saying this, Hawk Wilson glared fiercely at Elaine, waiting for her response. Elaine would rather die than agree. No matter how Hawk Wilson tried to coax or threaten her, she wouldn't yield. In the end, Hawk Wilson, enraged and humiliated, ordered Elaine to be locked up first, and then planned to gather the villagers the next day to announce Elaine's crimes and put her into the pig cage. Early the next morning, Hawk Wilson gathered all the villagers and told them the false accusations about Elaine. The two Wilson villagers also acted as his witnesses under Hawk Wilson's instructions. Poor Elaine, her mouth was tightly gagged, so it was impossible for her to defend herself. Her parents cried out in despair, but what could they do? In those days, this remote village of Wilson family village was like a forgotten world. Hawk Wilson was the village head, and he held the power of life and death, able to kill whoever he wanted. At that time, I was in the crowd, and I could not believe that Elaine would commit adultery with Stacy Wilson's cousin. By then, Elaine had already been put into the pig cage, preparing to be thrown into the river to be drowned alive. Naturally, I couldn't just stand by and watch the girl I loved die, so I rushed to Elaine to rescue her. However, Hawk Wilson's relatives swarmed around me, kicking and punching me relentlessly. I was overwhelmed with anger and cursed Hawk Wilson, calling him inhuman. This curse provoked Hawk Wilson to fury, as if I had ignited the wrath of a god of death. He ordered his men to use wooden sticks to break my arms and legs, then threw me down Shin Cliff. Elaine and I truly loved each other, but we were both treated inhumanely. Elaine was falsely accused of adultery in front of everyone, making her feel as if life was worse than death. Finally, under Hawk Wilson's command, Elaine was locked in the pig cage and thrown into the river, drowning to death in agony. The vicious Stacy Wilson, who was watching, laughed cheerfully, her body shaking with joy as she clapped her hands. After Elaine's death, Stacy Wilson had nightmares every night, always dreaming of Elaine turning into a vengeful ghost seeking revenge, leaving her tormented and terrified every day. After hearing about this, Hawk Wilson hired a Taoist priest skilled in magic. This priest was surnamed Chu, and he was deceitful and ruthless, willing to forsake righteousness for money. After receiving a handsome reward from Hawk Wilson, he agreed to do as Hawk Wilson asked, inflicting even more cruel persecution on Elaine. This wicked Taoist named Chu created a sinister sorcery of his own. The wicked Taoist Chu devised a way to skin the entire body of a deceased person, turning it into a drum made of human skin. This way, the soul of that person would be trapped in the human skin drum, never able to reincarnate. Hawk Wilson forcibly kept Elaine's corpse, not allowing her parents to take it away. He called the evil Taoist Chu to perform his magic. This wicked Taoist skinned Elaine, creating the human skin drum, and had to use magic for 7 days to trap Elaine's spirit inside the human skin drum. Once the human skin drum was made, Chu the Taoist could use it as a magical instrument. By simply beating the human skin drum, he could gather many wandering spirits and ghosts to do his bidding and commit evil acts. Since then, Stacy Wilson no longer had nightmares, and Wilson family village returned to its usual calm. Only Elaine's family and I were left with a broken heart. Several decades later, the evil Chu Taoist died of illness. By this time, Elaine's deep resentment had built up in the human skin drum for decades, and her spirit finally escaped from it. She wanted to reclaim her human skin, because without it, she couldn't reincarnate on time. Unfortunately, the descendants of Chu the evil Taoist had inherited his magic and were very powerful. They also highly valued the human skin drum because of its ability to summon wandering spirits and ghosts. Elaine made several attempts to reclaim the human skin drum, but she failed and almost had her soul destroyed. 127 years passed in the blink of an eye. During this time, Elaine was always a wandering ghost. By now, she had cultivated some spiritual powers, and had even regained her appearance from when she was alive. Even her appearance was exactly the same as when she was alive, and Elaine could appear in human form both day and night. Although her body was still as beautiful as it had been over 100 years ago, it was a cold body, without any warmth. Elaine had never forgotten the old affection, and over the years, she had always been searching for me. After much hardship, she finally found out that I had reincarnated, reborn in a small village in the northeast. Elaine was overjoyed, and she traveled thousands of miles to see me. In her heart, aside from the deep hatred for those who harmed her, there remained an unending longing for me. Elaine lay on her side on the bed, recalling the painful memories of the past that she wished to forget. Her tears fell onto the bed in my house, wetting the neatly folded bedding beside her, the very bedding she had folded herself before leaving. Listening to Elaine's tale of bitter sorrow, I looked up, tears flowing freely like a flood breaking through a dam. This time, I cried all the tears of my entire life. Big Boss Smith, who had always been the one to exorcise demons and subdue evil spirits, stood quietly beside, listening, without saying a word. Elaine finished speaking, and the room fell silent, as if it was filled only with ghosts, not humans. Silence hung for an unknown amount of time. Elaine's breath was weak, and it was clear that the worry on her forehead had worn her down, leaving her in misery. She had endured all her misfortunes, and now she seemed much more at ease. She looked at me deeply, her eyes full of emotion. Thank you, I'm going now. You must take good care of yourself. If fate allows, if you and I have a next life, Elaine wishes to be your bride. Hearing this, my heart surged like a raging storm, unable to bear the sorrow and tender emotions of a man. I completely lost control of myself, rushing over to Elaine, holding her cold body tightly, and said loudly, but you no longer have your human skin, you can't reincarnate. Can we still meet in the next life, Elaine? I don't want you to leave, I want you to be my ghost bride. Elaine looked at me with tender eyes, tears once again blurred her beautiful, radiant eyes. Brother, having you say this is enough. Tonight. I am truly happy. Elaine smiled, a smile full of happiness. I suddenly turned around, grabbed old Taoist priest by the collar with both hands, shaking him violently, and shouted, Taoist, Taoist, please save her. I don't want her to scatter into pieces, I want her to stay by my side forever. Old Taoist priest had long been moved by the fate of Elaine and me from our past life. Seeing me so agitated, he quickly said, all right, don't get agitated, I'll save her. Rest assured, there is still a way. Taoist, I beg you, please hurry. Old Taoist priest wasted no time. He reached out and pulled the talisman off Elaine's forehead, chanting incantations as he did so. After quite some time, he finally burned the talisman with fire. Don't worry, Billy, she's fine now. I ran over to Elaine, holding her in my arms. Her body was ice cold, and I couldn't help but shiver. But I didn't care about that, I just held her tightly. Elaine, you and I will never part, in life or death. Elaine nodded vigorously, Brother Billy, I have always waited for this day. Old Taoist priest stood up, patted the dust off himself, and then pulled out an old, yellowed book from his dirty and tattered Taoist robe, handing it to me. Billy, this is my untold secret. Tonight, I am giving it to you. I is breaking the rules tonight, there are spirits that must not be disturbed. I don't know if Patriarch will blame me. Today I give you this book, if you are destined, it will mean that I have taken a disciple for the sect. That way, it won't be in vain. I will continue my journey, and I hope you will take good care of yourself. If we are destined, we shall meet again. After saying that, old Taoist priest let his long sleeves flutter, and without looking back, walked out of the door. I let go of Elaine and prepared to go out to see old Taoist priest off, but as soon as I stepped into the yard, old Taoist priest's figure had already disappeared. It seems that master truly is a master, even his walking is without a trace, coming and going like the wind. I sighed with admiration in my heart. I returned to the house, laid out the bedding properly, and helped the weak Elaine into the bed. She was very tired now. Although there were many things I wanted to say to her, I held back. I turned off the light, letting her rest early, then turned and returned to my own room. That night, I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. I could not believe that Elaine and I had such a tragic past together. I recalled every smile and expression of Elaine, and thought that her greatest wish now was probably to find her human skin to reincarnate. Perhaps she was reluctant to reincarnate because of me, but I had to find a way to help her retrieve the human skin drum. It was Elaine's skin, after all. And those wicked people who had caused so much pain for both of us in our past lives, I needed to know where they had reincarnated in this life, and I had to take revenge. With all these thoughts in my head, I picked up the old, tattered book that old Taoist priest had given me. There was no name on the cover, and when I opened it, it was like reading celestial scriptures. It was full of strange symbols, similar to the charms that old Taoist priest had drawn. I looked at it for a long time but couldn't understand anything. I closed the book, thinking that it must contain all of old Taoist priest's skills. If I could understand it someday, I would certainly practice diligently. I put the old book into my wardrobe, then returned to the bed, ready to sleep. My peaceful life had been completely disrupted by the appearance of Elaine. The appearance of Elaine suddenly shattered the peace. Although I felt a bit physically and mentally tired, I still found life to be more fulfilling. Perhaps everyone's life yearns for a touch of brilliance to spice things up, even if that brilliance carries some sorrow. It wasn't until the middle of the night that I finally fell asleep. That night, I had many strange dreams. In the dream, sometimes Elaine was playing and laughing with me in the fields, and at other times, she would leave me, making me feel empty. In the ups and downs of the dream, I experienced many emotions, from deep sorrow to great joy. I thought that my meeting Elaine in this life must be karma, as described in Buddhism. The next morning, I woke up, and Mother, as usual, had already prepared breakfast. Then, Elaine and I had breakfast together. Everything that happened last night, Mother knew nothing about. Perhaps because Elaine had been at my house for several days now, I could see that Mother was somewhat puzzled. Why is this girl still not leaving? The death of Dave Swan in Dragon Harmony Village had caused quite a stir. It had been 2 or 3 days since the incident, and the cloud over the villagers' hearts was gradually lifting. The small Dragon Harmony Village also returned to its usual peace and tranquility. That day, Father also came back from the city. The family was in the middle of autumn harvest, and although there was still work left in the city, he hurried back. When Father came home, he was very surprised that Elaine had been staying at our house for a week. Except for me, everyone thought that Elaine, this beautiful girl, had an unclear background, and no one knew where she had come from. Fortunately, Father was a reasonable person. He saw that Elaine was well-mannered, elegant, and very understanding, so he didn't say much. It was just a bit strange that this girl seemed like a city person, so beautiful, yet why would she choose someone like me, a bumpkin? Our family has an old yellow ox. Every autumn harvest, we use an ox cart to haul corn back home. The crops in the field had all been harvested, and the remaining work was to bring in the corn, load it onto the cart, and bring it home. Thinking about it, I had to thank Elaine. If she hadn't called her good friends to help that night, I wouldn't know how many more days it would have taken me to finish. Father prepared the ox cart to head to the field, and I climbed onto it. Elaine insisted on coming along to help. I couldn't convince her otherwise, so I agreed. I knew in my heart that Elaine just wanted to be by my side, even if it meant going to the field to work. We left the house and made our way to the entrance of the village. There was still a large group of idle people there, chatting about all sorts of things. Old Lady Sun, who had the habit of telling strange stories for years, was also there. When the ox cart passed by, Old Lady Sun first exchanged a few words with Father, then turned her yellowish eyes to Elaine. I could clearly see the hatred in those eyes, and I couldn't help but feel puzzled. Why did Old Lady Sun hate Elaine so much? It looked like a scene of enemies meeting. The ox cart left the village and reached a place with no one around. Elaine, sitting on the cart, spoke to me in a low voice. "Billy, just now that old Lady Miller kept staring at me, I'm afraid she might try to do something to me." Hearing Elaine say this, I couldn't help but worry for her. In my impression, most people in this small rural village were kind and simple. But ever since learning about what Elaine and I had gone through in our past lives over 100 years ago, for the first time, I began to fear the malice of human hearts. People could harm each other to the point of death. Elaine's words were not without reason. Looking at old Lady Miller's hateful gaze, it was really possible that she might try to harm Elaine. I couldn't help but start worrying about her. Old Lady Miller was always mysterious, like a village witch, and if she had set her eyes on Elaine, it would truly be a big problem. "Elaine, why is old Lady Miller targeting you? Maybe she knows that those black bugs were made by me. You know, it made Michael Miller lose face. Wouldn't she hate me for that?" Elaine whispered, afraid Father would hear, so she didn't say any more. I thought the same. From the very first moment old Lady Miller saw Elaine, her behavior had been very strange. Every time she saw Elaine, her gaze was odd. It seemed that besides me, she also knew Elaine's secret in all of Dragon Harmony Village. Harvesting corn in the countryside was a very tedious and hard job. For those who had never worked in the fields, it was hard to imagine. At this time, Elaine had become a member of our family. More precious still was that she worked just as fast as I did. Father watched all this, secretly amazed. He could never have imagined that a city girl could do such hard and dirty work. Everyone worked in the field until late in the afternoon, and they were getting ready to head back. After dinner, Father and Mother sat and chatted, talking about Elaine. Father said, "It seems that this girl has some feelings for Billy. Billy is almost 20 years old now, it's about time we find him a wife." "Wife, what do you think of Elaine? This girl is good, indeed. But she is from the city. Would she really choose a farming family like ours? She treats Billy well, but maybe it's just a momentary feeling. As time goes by, it might change. Even if she agrees, her parents might not agree to this marriage. I don't think it's going to work out." Father nodded after hearing this, feeling that Mother made sense. "Yes, wife, you make a good point. Do you remember Sister Smith from the west end of the village? She's mentioned several times about introducing Lana to Billy. I think Lana is a hardworking and honest girl. If Billy could marry such a wife, it would be good. I've been waiting for you to decide. Sister Smith has already talked to me about it a few times." "All right, if you agree, then let Sister Smith arrange a meeting for Billy and Lana tomorrow. Who knows, it might work out." Within a couple of days, all the fieldwork was finished. Old Lady Smith from the west end of the village really did bring Lana to my house. Lana's parents also came along. I had no idea about any of this beforehand. Lana and I grew up playing together. Between a man and a woman, being too familiar makes it hard to develop romantic feelings. When I saw today's setup, the matchmaker, the parents from both sides, it all seemed very formal and grand, really putting me in a tough spot. In my heart, I kept blaming my parents. Couldn't you at least discuss this with me first? Even though I didn't want to, I still had to maintain my composure and not show my reluctance. It was clear that Lana had some feelings for me. She kept sitting next to the bed, fiddling nervously with the hem of her clothes, her face showing a bit of excitement. But every now and then, when she glanced at Elaine, her expression became awkward, clearly uncomfortable with Elaine's presence. Elaine, being so sharp and intelligent, obviously understood what Lana's arrival meant. She quietly returned to her room and closed the door behind her. Seeing all of this made me anxious, thinking, why bring more chaos into my life when there's no need? I had no feelings at all for Lana, it was simply impossible. Elaine staying at my house these past days had already become a topic of gossip throughout Dragon Harmony Village, with people saying all sorts of things. If it weren't for Mr. Smith and Old Lady Smith saying that there was nothing between Elaine and me, Old Lady Smith wouldn't have brought Lana here for a marriage interview today. After some time chatting, Old Lady Smith secretly called me outside. "Billy, Lana is a good girl, hardworking, and skilled. What do you think of her? Tell Auntie, don't be shy. Do you like her or not?" "Auntie Smith, I've always seen Lana as a little sister." "I don't agree." Old Lady Smith tried to persuade me for a long time, but it was of no use. Finally, she had no choice but to turn and go back inside. The matchmaking meeting ended in failure, but it hadn't completely concluded. My parents kept urging me, and Old Lady Smith was even more persistent, coming over every other day to talk about it, making me extremely annoyed. In the end, with no other way out, I told Elaine that I wanted to be engaged to her. To an ordinary person, my decision might seem crazy, but to me, there was only one thought in my mind: in this life, I would marry no one but Elaine, even if she was a female ghost. When Elaine saw me make such a crazy decision, she was initially very happy, but then she became somber and said, "Brother, see how, I understand your feelings for me, and I am very touched. But I am a ghost, and you are human, we cannot be together. I held Elaine's hand tightly. Elaine, I don't care about any of that. Let's just continue the love we left unfinished in our past life. Elaine couldn't resist my persuasion and finally agreed. But the real problem arose: if we wanted to make this believable, Elaine's parents not being present would be inappropriate. When I told Elaine about this concern, she just chuckled and said, "This is easy, Billy, get me some paper and a pen." Luke and Con dash Dave Swan Luke and dash Dave Niyum 2 Ka Cho Chet Tu Ka 2 dash Billy Thompson Die Hack dash Blackie Tu Lean, Elaine 10 Long Hop Long dash Dragon Harmony Village Ba Vong dash Old Lady Smith Vong dash Smith Lu Hai Tai dash Richard Swan, Lucas Ventura Granny Tun dash Granny Miller Tun Bon Tien dash Michael Miller Thiat Dien dash Lana Tangia Trey dash Wilson Family Village Tan Hai Nan dash Hawk Wilson Tan Hong Mute dash Stacy Wilson Trung dash Anderson Kong Dai Nan dash Jack Taylor Trung. Fuck Juan dash a Nelson Dai Ko Sun dash Dai Gu Shan Ni Na dash Lily Lao Dao Sai dash Old Taoist Priest Dao Truong dash Taoist.